Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be asking, as Christians, how can we respond to the rise of Jew hatred that's dominating our news headlines? Hello and welcome to the programme, and today's guest is all the way from Sussex, not very far from the studios. His name is Alistair Scott. He's a friend of mine and a friend to Revelation TV. You're also the UK director for Joseph Storehouse, together with the UK director for the European Coalition for Israel as well. So warm welcome to the programme, Alistair.
Good to be here with you again.
and Alistair, do you want to just give us a little bit of an update about the ministry of Joseph Storehouse, because it has been difficult with so many of our viewers not being able to connect as we would with Israel. So there's been a bit of a disconnect over the last 2 years because of COVID-19, the fact that we can't meet together and have conferences, that we can't actually then, I think they have opened up Israel to tourism, but for 2 years that hasn't been a possibility. So there has been a bit of a disconnect really between Israel and ourselves because we haven't been able to meet together.
Exactly. Yes, it's been a challenging time in many ways, and yet in so many ways donations for Joseph Storehouse Vision for Israel have been amazing. You know, if anything, there's an increase since pre-pandemic, which shows the heart of people for Israel in this nation particularly. But the work continues. I mean, the challenges have been that it's not been possible to take people in. I haven't been able to travel into Israel myself for the last couple of years, which is always tough going. We always enjoy being there. But the work is ongoing. We haven't been able to do the conferences. We haven't been able to do conferences and seminars here in England, which we were doing monthly before. We were doing 4 every month. So for the last 2 years, there's been none of those going on. But you know, things like the Holocaust survivors, the work we do with the Holocaust survivors there in Israel continues. It had to change because many of the times where before we were bringing survivors and the young kids and trauma victims into our new building warehouse in Modi'in there, most of the stuff has been more going to them, handing them vouchers for food and so on, rather than actually gathering them together and not only entertaining them, but actually listening to the stories. I think one of the biggest challenges, particularly speaking about Holocaust survivors, is loneliness. They do struggle financially, of course they do, and very often they are choosing whether they have medication and food in extreme circumstances. But when you go and meet with them and they can actually allow them to speak as much as they want to speak, that's such a blessing. Every one of them would say company is what they look for more than anything else. But you know, the call of Vision for Israel, Joseph Storehouse, is both for the spiritual and the physical restoration of the nation. So not only are we doing the humanitarian aid stuff, which is regular, goes on year after year in the various departments, but we're also producing stuff that goes out to teach the churches around the world and to make people aware, governments aware of what's going on as far as the truth of Israel. I mean, I know you and I understand with the sources we can get true media coverage for what's going on in Israel and the surrounding areas, but very often if you're just watching terrestrial TV, you don't get any idea of what is really happening in the nation. So yeah, that's our call. Here in England, we have the staff who have continued to look after donors and everything else. And we now do, rather than doing the four monthly meetings, we have a once a month Mariah meeting, we call it, which comes out of Israel or sometimes out of the USA, depending on where Barry and Batya are at the time. So I'm usually involved in that in some form. And, you know, we get about a couple of hundred people watching on a Zoom screen, which is fun. We've got used to being Zoomers, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Years. So it's exciting. The word is still getting out there. The face-to-face stuff, I missed a lot. I know Barry misses it a lot too, because there's so much more you can do when you are with people as far as ministering to people and encouraging them.
I think my favourite speaking venue is definitely the Emmanuel Centre, run by Joseph Storehouse, and those meetings. And I've been blessed by having the opportunity to speak on a few occasions, which I'm
probably going to restart that in towards the end of the year. Assuming everything continues as it is at the moment, we will be meeting next week to talk things through. But I think Purim and Passover is going to be too soon to put things together. But I think our heart is to get something there again. So yeah,
that's good.
Make sure you're free.
Okay, I'll put that in the diary. Yes. Alistair, that'd be great. In today's programme, we're really discussing the kind of Christian response to the rise of Jew hatred, and already approaching the end of February in 2022, and already seeing that so many news stories are dominated by issues relating to the Holocaust or Jew hatred. I mean, at the beginning of the year, we had the hostage crisis at the Synagogue in Texas. This is followed by the awful comments made by Whoopi Goldberg that the Holocaust was not about race. We know it was. Then we've had Jimmy Carr, the famous comedian, discuss the Holocaust in a way of saying that about the Gypsies, which has offended the Romani community. And it seems like this is an issue that is not actually going away, but is increasing. Why do you think we are seeing so many news headlines being dominated by issues such as Jew hatred or anti-Semitism today?
It does seem that the whole media sway is so anti-Israel and anti the Jew generally. So they are always reporting things with a slant, which is making Israel as the aggressor rather than, it's the Israel Defense Force. That tends to tell you what it's all about. They're defending their rights to exist, and the media sway against Israel is enormous. So people are being fed what the media want them to hear, and therefore it really does cause greater anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, the hatred in our societies. And sadly, I mean, I don't know if you saw that a couple of weeks ago. I think it was actually on the Holocaust Memorial Day, Remembrance Day, where fortunately the BBC News did actually show the film of the two older men, Jewish men, closing off their businesses. It was only around about 20 to 10 at night, so it wasn't sort of middle, 1 o'clock in the morning. And the guy who walks past them turns around, and he's a young, very strong looking, looks like he's straight out of the gym, turns around and starts kicking them and punching them. And you think, that was on Holocaust Memorial Day or the day before. I can't remember the exact timing. And I'm thinking, this is London. I was so glad that our own government came immediately and spoke about the horror of it, and the man was arrested. What happens beyond his arrest, we don't know yet. But two old men who couldn't defend themselves. The fear, when I saw the clip and see the fear in their eyes, and I think, we as Christians must not allow that to happen. We have that word out of Isaiah 62, verse 6 and 7. We shall never hold our peace. We shall not be silenced. But the world is trying to silence. The world is trying to forget. And I think we're going to touch on the denial of the Holocaust at some point.
Absolutely, and that's a very good point, Alistair. I think it's also important to make that when we go through very difficult times, like we are now, it always seems as if the Jewish people are the world's scapegoat. Yep. And this is also why we're seeing an escalation in Jew hatred, as well as this no cultural reference points anymore. Because in previous generations, Christians and society would know about Israel. They would know about the Jewish people from the Bible. That would be their source of reference. Yep. Because there is no longer that understanding of the word. We've moved so far away from our Judeo-Christian heritage that there isn't any more reference points anymore. And this is why so many people are apathetic or indifferent. But, it depends on whether as a nation we are blessed or whether we're cursed. Exactly. Depends on our treatment of the Jewish people. And after everything the Jewish people have given us, not only in terms of the scriptures, the Bible, the prophets, the law, the Ten Commandments, and of course our own Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach. They've also prospered our nation in terms of business, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of arts, in terms of politics. Every sphere of life has been blessed because of our Jewish community. And we know that if they're in trouble and they're thinking of leaving, then on one hand, we know that God is using this to bring his people home, yes. But on the other hand, it means that our nation then becomes less enriched, and you know, the creativity and the intelligentsia of the nation just virtually evaporate.
Yeah, and you know, it is a fulfillment. We're living in that time. I mean, it's an exciting time, even though it's a horrific time as well, because of the dangers and the perils that go on. But you know, it's the fulfillment of that word in Jeremiah 31:10, you know, where it says, you know, it's speaking to the nations, hear you nations and you isles afar off. He who scattered his people is now gathering them back and will watch over them as a shepherd does his flock. And we're seeing whatever it takes, the Lord is going to fulfill that plan and get his people back into the nation. And then the promise of giving them a new heart, new understanding, new spirit, and they would recognize Yeshua Mashiach. So it is an exciting time, but you know, while we have our people here, and even when the Jewish people here with us, we as the Christians need to stand with them, need to let them know that we're here for them. And sadly, even you know, when you're talking about the biblical knowledge, but even amongst Christians, there is this replacement theology that's come in, which has kind of taken people's minds to read the scriptures in the wrong way. And really, we need a revival of understanding, even amongst the Christians, to stand with our Jewish people. Because you quoted that verse earlier from Genesis 12. You know, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you will be cursed. And I've seen one thing with our government, no matter what's going on behind the scenes and so on, they are far more pro-Israel than a government for a long, long time. And they're openly standing with, I mean, we see this in the other work I do in ECI, that our foreign minister is instructing the ambassadors at the UN to vote with Israel, not stand on the fence, not vote against them. So that's a real shift for our nation, and yeah, we need to really acknowledge that and thank God for it.
Amen. Yeah, called the golden era in Anglo-Israeli relations. Yeah. We know when it comes to Jew hatred that this is the world's oldest hatred, and one of the clearest Bible references is in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, which says, and the word discusses how that a new king over Egypt arose, who did not know Joseph, and looked to then plot against the Jewish people, saying that they could make alliances with our enemies and bring about our destruction or downfall. So therefore we have to bring them into captivity, and we have to oppress them because they could become more powerful us. But the key word there really is a history lesson, that the new king did not know Joseph. In other words, he didn't know what Joseph did in rescuing the Egyptian empire from those years of famine and saved Egypt. So there wasn't any recognition of that. And then out of that, because of that lack of historical knowledge and understanding, this is when, as a new pharaoh, he started to persecute the Jewish people. And again, isn't that a warning for us today, that when we discuss issues relating to Jew hatred, whether it's the Holocaust, it's that when we forget our history, we then are not able to learn from it and make the same awful mistakes.
Exactly. I mean, there's been so many times in the past where we've had these kind of sessions and teachings that have been released of, you know, lest we forget, you know, we learn from history, don't allow history to repeat itself. And of course, we're at that time now where, particularly when we talk about Holocaust survivors, they are getting older. There are fewer of them. I think it's 160,000 left in Israel at the moment, because they are in their 90s. And their stories won't be heard unless we as Christians actually continue to remember them. We mustn't allow history to repeat itself. And not just about the Jewish community, but that's specifically what we're talking about for any oppression for any group. You know, you're talking about the Exodus chapter 1 there. The previous verses, the one you read, actually talk about they feared the Jews because although they were slaves and they weren't rebellious, they had become strong physically and strong in numbers, and that's what tends to happen with the Jewish people because of the blessing of the Lord God on their lives. And it was that fear element that got this new king who didn't remember Joseph in the past to want to remove them, you know, and gave the midwives that instruction: if there's any males, kill them. I mean, that's such an extreme thinking, but it happens when you don't recognize your history and you don't recognize the benefits of having a Jewish community who are, you know, look at the industry in Israel at the moment for a new nation. It's thriving. They're the forerunners of almost all technical development. And we have to acknowledge that and not see them as a threat, but see them as the blessing that the Bible tells us they are. But as Christians, we need to remind our own fellow Christians, read what the Bible says, get the understanding and the heart of God for his nation, his people, and he hasn't chosen them for any other reason that he wants to use them to be a blessing to the world. So it needs a whole mindset turning around, changing the way we think, but we need to be continuing to stand up and be counted and tell the story. Tell the story.
Absolutely. And also, if we go deeper into this, we know that this is a satanic plot, just it was in the time of Esther and how God raised up Esther and Mordecai to save the Jewish people during the time of Purim. And Purim is a Jewish feast that has dedicated this with Haman, who wanted to completely destroy the Jewish people across the ancient Persian Empire. And another kind of warning that this is what evil nation and evil people want to do. And if we look at the heart of some of the most evil political ideologies, at the very heart and the very root is Jew hatred. We know which is satanic.
Yeah, and it is. It's because it's not the people. It's always the spirit behind that drives the people that we really need to be aiming at, because, you know, we have that authority to take authority in the spiritual dimension. And therefore we mustn't allow ourselves to be deceived, think in the wrong way, but actually take that authority and believe God for a turning around of the hearts of people who are out to annihilate, because it's a spiritual problem.
And we also realise as well, when we kind of unpack the prophecies made about the resurrection of Israel as a nation, look at Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, the minor prophets, all talks about how that God will restore the Jewish people to their ancient covenant homeland, which is the nation of Israel. And this has been occurring really since Israel was re-established as a nation state back on the 14th of May 1948. And yet so many Christians are ignorant to what God is doing in Israel and the Middle East, and therefore ignorant to his kind of overall global plan for mankind, because they fail to see God's promises or even fail to read the Old Testament, which is, I think, a very, very dangerous theological position and a viewpoint to take.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to look at that short history, 1948, as we talked about, where their survival was miraculous. They were surrounded by neighboring nations that wanted to wipe them out. Europe was not exactly going to be friendly to help them, but God did. You know, God is for them, and therefore God, as he says in Joel chapter 3 verse 16, I will be a shelter to my people. So it's something we need to get on board in the European world, the Western world, the African world, the Asian world, that God is not going to allow his word not to be fulfilled, and everything he has said is going to come to pass. So, and the Jewish people are not looking to dominate. They're not world dominators like, you know, some of the other countries we could mention. They just want to live a peaceful life in their land, and doing what they do best, which is creating. You know, they have been inspired by the Lord, chosen by the Lord, and the world benefits from what God does in that land.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellently produced video that's produced by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and this is No to Anti-Semitism.
لقد أفسد اليهود لقد تغطس اليهود.
And we will have to say no to anti-Semitism and no to hate, as put out by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, as we see a real global increase in Jew hatred around the world that we can't ignore for much longer. Alistair, it's a few weeks ago that we all remembered the absolute horrors of the Holocaust as we marked the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, known as International Holocaust Memorial Day. And yet, despite the awareness of the Holocaust and what went on, and despite the media coverage of it, why do you think we're seeing such an increase in attacks against Jewish people? I mean, when we're showing that video, I'll share with our viewers, I was discussing with you how in New York, because in the northeast of the United States have had a massive snow covering of snow, and someone was working a snowplow, saw two Orthodox Jews and deliberately went past them and got them covered completely in snow, and his response was, did this for JC. And it's these attitudes now that anti-Semitism has penetrated society. We're seeing it with our celebrities as well, that we're seeing this manifestation of Jew hatred.
Yeah, I mean, this is historical, isn't it? This problem where did it for JC. I mean, for centuries, the Christians have kind of put the blame on the Jews for killing Jesus or Yeshua, which is nonsense, as we know, anyone who reads the scriptures. And it's very sad to think of people doing that. The Chancellor, he was not even a Christian, just thought it was a fun thing to do, a ridiculous thing to do. But it is something that we shouldn't watch, and most of us are the same. I mean, I'm the same. If I watch a TV news program or something, it can touch my heart, and then Match of the Day comes on and I'm into football. But we mustn't allow that to happen with regards anything, but particularly about this Jewish situation. If we see these things going on, because I had a letter from Barrett just last couple of days ago, which said that in USA, I mean, it's interesting you talk about New York, that there's been more than a 70% increase in anti-Semitism items going on in USA. Now, USA has always been the closest friend and ally of Israel and the most sort of benevolent to the Jewish people, but it's changed rapidly, and I think statistically it's like up over 50% across the world anyway. And when we see these things, we've got to challenge it. We've got to speak to people in authority. We've got to write to our MPs, because it's much more rare that we see things on the television in our nation, but it is happening. And probably in my own community in Sussex, there is not that many Jewish people, but there are a few. And I know from conversations you have, there is great fear amongst the Jewish communities now, just being out in the streets, in places where they used to feel safe, they realize there's a threat from individuals, groups of people, to harm them, and some people think it's a joke as well. They think it's it's all right to do, and that's a historical thing that needs to be challenged. You said earlier that the Jews have been made scapegoats, and that's true. Throughout history, they've been the ones that have been blamed for the most ridiculous things. Even 9/11, there's the conspiracy that the Jews were behind that. It's just madness that how easy it is for people to point the finger at the Jews when times are tough.
Absolutely, and the other point we're seeing really is the role that social media is playing in all of this. And the big, massive internet companies like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and others, TikTok, are not doing enough to rid their platforms of Jew hatred. But also what's very, very concerning is that we've also seen an alarming increase, according to the Anti-Defamation League, of Holocaust denial on social media as well, and this has come about through some COVID-19 conspiracies that the Jews control the world, and so therefore people are not believing the Holocaust actually took place, which is probably the most offensive thing you can say to a Jewish person, or particularly a survivor who survived the horrors of the Holocaust. And there's enough video archive material to realise that the Holocaust took place, that Jewish families were torn apart and murdered, and today casts a dark shadow over the Jewish people. So to say that it never happened is the most slanderous, most evil thing that anyone could possibly say.
Absolutely mad. It's crazy to even, but history is history, and it's there, so clear for anyone. If you didn't live through it, you can read about it, and it's factual. But it's happening, because even in the UN, there's certain nations, which you don't need to name, who continue to bring this Holocaust denial business up front, you know, saying it never really happened, and it's a whole conspiracy of the Jewish people. And it's nonsense, because it's within most of our lifetimes, or you know, slightly beyond mine. Certainly a long time beyond yours, but historical facts, there's programs you can watch, there's films that have been made, and to deny it, as you say, is so offensive to the Jewish people particularly, but it's offensive to the world, because as soon as you deny it and you get a few people on board, and the media has a lot to answer for, because these media people that you've mentioned, they have become so big, it's very hard to police. Absolutely. And unless they have a conscience themselves and start to self-police, there's nothing a government can do at this time. You can hound them, you can speak to them, but it's down to the individuals as to what they will do to let the truth come forward and stop the denial stories from being put out there. Because people will read it and people will come on board. And we've got to make sure it doesn't have prayer. Prayer is an important part of our Christian life. You know, we truly need to be praying that these things get exposed, dealt with, because if it can't be done with man on earth, we have to have intervention from the heavens to stop these stories from being put out.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent video, again produced by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, that looks into the horrible issue of Holocaust denial.
Is Holocaust denial dangerous? As anti-Semitism surges around the world, Holocaust deniers spread their evil message, denying the attempted genocide of the Jewish people, including by creating doubts about historical facts, creates a real and present danger. Many people don't know what actually happened during World War II. Only about half of the world's population has even heard of the Holocaust. Anti-Semites exploit this ignorance. They use ancient stereotypes and adapt modern conspiracy theories to advance their agenda. Israel haters invert the Holocaust, appropriating it to attack the world's only Jewish state. Distorting the Holocaust, belittling the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, dishonors the memory of the victims. Holocaust denial and distortion feed the surge of anti-Semitism and encourage attacks on individual Jews and Jewish institutions. Is there anything we can do? Yes, we can help educate the next generation and encourage local governments and international institutions to take Holocaust denial seriously. We can work to ensure that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial is adopted worldwide. We have an obligation to future generations to stand against Holocaust denial. Together, we can make a difference.
And such an important message to be conveyed there by the Israeli Foreign Ministry about the dangers of Holocaust denial. It was at the beginning of the year, Alistair, that we noticed that the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution aimed at combating Holocaust denial, and it represents only the second resolution to help protect Israel and the Jewish people at the UN. So on the one hand, I think this is to be applauded, that UN is finally taking the issue of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism seriously. But then at the other level, we see different agencies in the UN actually producing anti-Semitic reports, treating Israel if Israel is the Jew among the nations. And clearly this is a kind of, is this a token gesture to the Jewish people in Israel? Or is this kind of ignoring everything else that the UN is doing?
I think this is, again, it's one of those big challenges, because watching that clip there, it talks about education, and we have to re-educate. I was kind of surprised to say the statistics about 54% of the world haven't heard, or was 54 have and 46 haven't. And therefore that gives us a huge job to do. And I know from friends that are working in the United Nations, there is a sway of change going on there, and nations who have stood against Israel in the past are befriending Israel and are moving in that direction to be for Israel rather than against. But the deniers are there, and we have to be sure. I mean, the words there said, we can make a difference. We have to make a difference. It's not just, you know, it's not a choice. It's something that we're instructed to do by God. I really believe that, to make sure that we do make a difference in the structure, the education, the stuff that's going around. And that's again, one of the things Vision for Israel is very good at, is getting programs out, getting truth out into using, you know, it's fantastic that we have Revelation TV, and there are others who are taking out and putting out some of the films and programs they're making to make sure that it gets into the heart of, I mean, it tends to be more the believers, the Christians who are watching it, but we need to reach the Christians as much as we need to reach outside. So having conferences outside is important, but we need to make sure that our own people are on board and are praying in the right way. And standing in the right way with Israel. So yeah, there's a lot of denial out there, but there's a lot of good stuff going on underground which hasn't come to the surface. I mean, the United Nations do have a Holocaust memorial service there, as do the European Union. It's annually on the 27th of January, and that, you know, that kind of checks people's hearts out. And, you know, as the ministers are gathering together, they hear the truth, they hear the numbers, and 6 million Jews. You know, how can you deny that? I mean, you just have to look statistically at the size of one of the oldest people groups and how few of them remain. And how can you deny, why can you not understand the reasons for that? Is throughout history, there has been attempts to annihilate, to stop them from being the people they're called to be. So yeah, we've got a lot of ammunition on our side. We just need to know how to use it. I mean, and when I talk about ammunition, I don't mean aggression. I mean education.
Well, aggression in prayer as well.
Absolutely.
That's not a bad thing.
With the spiritual warfare, is for certain, it's a good place to have that.
And Alistair, very much seems that the issue of Jew hatred has gone mainstream. Before, we see this with being carried by extreme left-wing ideology, extreme right-wing ideology like neo-Nazism and fascism, the anti-Semitism is at the core of their belief, and we're seeing now as well it's becoming the core belief of the left-wing, the Marxists and others, as we saw that with the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. But also what we're seeing as well is that anti-Semitism has gone mainstream. The fact is that celebrities now are being caught up in this anti-Semitic trap and saying stuff on air which is completely anti-Semitic and hurtful to Jewish people, which means that this is a bigger problem than we first kind of realised once it's gone mainstream. And we've got a video to show you now, and this is of the US famous actress Whoopi Goldberg saying that the Holocaust had nothing to do with race.
Let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. No, it's not about race.
It's about a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man.
And Whoopi Goldberg, we hope that you don't bring it up again because what you said is extremely, extremely offensive. And it's this ignorance, I think, that we're seeing now in a celebrity culture, lack of understanding of the Holocaust. And to say that the Holocaust was not about race when Hitler wanted to build the Aryan race, a super race made up of blonde-haired and blue-eyed Germans. We also see that he wanted to systematically destroy the Jewish race. So how can you say that the Holocaust was not about race when this was at the heart of Hitler's Nazi ideology?
It's crazy, isn't it? And you can see from what Whoopi Goldberg was saying there, she has no understanding at all and needs education herself, because she's seeing racism as being color, you know, black, white, yellow, whatever. Whereas a race is a group of people, and the Jewish people are a race, and the plan was to wipe them off the face of the earth. It's a plan that's even current in certain neighboring nations around Israel. That has never been removed from a lot of their doctrine, is that they want to take the Jewish people out of the world. So yeah, that's such a good example of lack of education, isn't it? And I guess she's very much involved in Black Lives Matter, and we don't need to go there. But race is people. People from one area to another area. It doesn't matter what the color of their skin is. And she needs to, well, I think she's tried to backtrack from what I'm hearing, but getting herself deeper and deeper in difficult situations there.
Yeah, this is the response from Eli Kohanim, who's a former US Deputy Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism, tweeted at the time, this is what she said. She said, "Shame on Whoopi Goldberg. Apparently she could use some education on the Holocaust," and retweeted that Hitler's entire propaganda machine spewed the message that Jews were an inferior race to the Germans, who were pure Aryan race. And then they mentioned 6 million Jews based on this belief. Isn't it vital that, for example, there has been a massive kind of media backlash against Whoopi Goldberg for those comments she's made? I think she's been taken off air from that chat show in the States. But it's important that we speak out about lies and misinformation when it comes to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Right? That's what I'm saying all the way through. We must challenge these people. They are given the platform so regularly because of their fame, and when they start expressing things, you know, so often with fan clubs, people who look at somebody who's, you know, an idol in some form, a hero, they listen to whatever they say and they think whatever they say is right, but this is totally wrong, and therefore it needs to be challenged. And I'm so glad that even within the media circles in the USA, they have challenged her, and hopefully she will come back with having re-educated herself and speak more righteously in the future. But she's not the only one. She's one of those that's been exposed at the moment. You know, there's a scripture, isn't there, that talks about out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, you know. And I think very often when people speak like that, it actually shows a kind of problem within their inner being. And I think that's what's been exposed here with, I mean, look at her name, Whoopi Goldberg. You know, you'd almost imagine that is a Jewish name, but she's chosen it out of preference rather than truth.
I know that Yad Vashem has invited Whoopi Goldberg to visit the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and she should to see it for herself and understand it, because it's so important to understand what's going on.
I've never met anyone who hasn't been to the Yad Vashem and not come out in bits and have their thinking changed if it needed to be changed, or confirmed if it needed to be confirmed. So it would be the best thing they could do, even if we need to pay for it to go there. But I don't think we need to. And
also the other kind of, we're looking at some of the news headlines. Alistair, some of the other news headlines has been dominated by the comedian Jimmy Carr for speaking at a comedy event which was filmed by Netflix, in which he talked about liking the murder of the Romani Gypsies during the Holocaust, and of course this has caused public outrage. But the fact that he's able to say that and have that as a joke to talk about the Holocaust, isn't there a danger that, again, what it's showing is that in society we are becoming desensitized to the horrors of the Holocaust. So therefore, it's okay to use the Holocaust as a joke. And of course, you know, thousands of Romani Gypsies perished at the hands of the Nazis. And to make a joke of genocide is absolutely horrific. So maybe this is one step too far for him, because he wanted to fight against cancel culture, but he's given it a reason to be cancelled.
Yeah, again, comedy seems to have gone to such an extreme now. The things that, again, comedians are allowed to say and get away with. I mean, I don't think they'd be allowed to say it on television, but certainly in their part of their shows, they seem to be able to make jokes about things which are not funny, and yet people think they're funny. So again, I read this story at the weekend, and I thought, well, he has to be challenged. You know, it's not a joke matter. This was thousands and tens of thousands of people who were destroyed by a regime that hated the Jews and was the Aryan race they were trying to create, and therefore another man who needs his education right. I mean, I think he's kind of thinking, well, it was only a joke, but it's not only a joke, because people hear what you're saying, and it's offensive to the people you're talking about. You know, the Romani group. You know, they don't deserve that. No more than the Jewish people need to have jokes made about them, how they dress, or whatever it may be. So challenge again. Let's challenge these guys, and you know, almost like, you know, if you go too fast in your car, you need to go on one of these courses to be educated. I think we should get some education courses for some of these people in high places who are saying things they shouldn't be saying.
Absolutely. So let's have a look now at this excellent speech made by the late Robert Ristrich, who was considered one of the world's leading experts in anti-Semitism. This was at the conference sponsored by the Israeli Foreign Ministry on combating anti-Semitism back in 2015, and he's addressing this during a kind of dinner party. So if you hear plates clattering and cutlery, then this is just in the background. But what he says is the most important thing to listen to.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I'm in the rather curious position, after listening carefully to the presentation by Dan Shapiro, of really having to ask myself a classic Jewish question, which is, if things are really so good, and we have so many strong supporters around the world, including governments and especially the United States government, why are things so bad? I think it is a relevant question. Because as someone who has spent the last 40 years, it's exactly 40 years, since I first embarked on my own engagement with the issue of anti-Semitism, as someone who had just completed a doctorate and was very familiar with the student climate of that era, I'm talking about the mid-1970s, the time when that notorious United Nations resolution, Zionism is a form of racism, Zionism is racism, was passed by a majority of states at the United Nations, with immediate implications for Jewish student life, first of all, on university campuses. What we're seeing today, although an escalation, although deeply troubling, is not new. That was the beginning of my engagement. And the first point I want to make, in the limited time available to me, is that I believe that it is long overdue for the Jewish world and for all who are concerned with combating anti-Semitism to change the diskette. Many of those esteemed colleagues here in this room, of course, don't need to be told this. But in a broader sense, I feel that when we discuss Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, we tend to think almost inevitably about those forms of anti-Semitism which we are familiar with, not just from the history books, but also from everyday and social experience. And I believe that that traditional anti-Semitism, whether it be racist, whether it be religious, nationalist, economic, while it is still present, while in some places it is even partly resurgent, is not the main problem. It's not the core issue that we need to address if we are going to have a serious chance of really counteracting and successfully hitting back against the anti-Semitism that is today predominant. And what I mean by that is that essentially in recent years, certainly since the beginning of this century, and I believe it dates much earlier than that, the focus of anti-Semitic attacks on the Jewish people has been primarily directed at the state of Israel as the embodiment of collective Jewish existence, of the Jewish people and what it represents, and the return of the Jews to this land. This is the primary vector through which anti-Semitic ideas, sentiments, actions are expressed. Whether they come from the left and the more extreme left, whether they come from the far right, which has also adopted the anti-Zionist framework increasingly to express even its more traditional forms of anti-Semitism, or whether it comes from that force which today, and this is my second point, I believe is overwhelmingly the spearhead, the driving force of Israel hatred and Jew hatred around the world. And that is radical Islam.
What an incredible man, and sadly he is no longer with us, but certainly written a lot of books on the issue of Jew hatred and was considered the world's leading expert in Jew hatred, and that was the late Robert Ristrich, and thankfully I got the chance to do an interview with him shortly before he died in 2015, a big loss. There's a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight that we can gain from Dr. Robert Ristrich's 40-year study on Jew hatred. Now, his own nation of birth is Britain, would be shocked to discover that according to the Community Security Trust, publishing for the first 6 months of 2021, seen that there has been a 50% increase in reported anti-Semitic incidences in this country alone, which is absolutely horrific. And isn't this another reminder for our viewers and Christians to be alert to the danger of Jew hatred and to make the Jewish people feel that we're befriending them and we're standing up for them?
Absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the things, I mean, what I would urge people, it's so easy to think somebody else will do it as Christians. And yet, you know, this anti-Semitism, which is rising year by year, and it's almost like 50%. Oh well, that's a lot of a problem. But we have to do something about it, and don't just think I'll sit back and I know this is wrong, and somebody else is bound to take it up. We need to take it up. We need to be active in challenging these situations. I was thinking, as I was listening to Robert speaking there, it was in the 90s really where things really changed in Israel. I mean there was the Intifada going on before that. You were there at some of that time, weren't you, studying and so on? But where it was more aimed at property and fields and the kibbutzes, and suddenly in the mid 90s, and really was the birth of Vision for Israel. It started with the bomb attacks on buses and innocent people being murdered, literally, and you know it was Islamic led, you know, by the Palestinian groups at the time, But it was horrendous, and you know, it was that time when Barry and Batcher actually, they'd just come back from a tour of South Africa, and their daughter, their oldest daughter, who would have been on that bus, stayed home to welcome them home, and she lost 4 of her best friends on that bus. And the compassion that it raised in Barry and Batcher was to start doing the work we're doing to reach out to the trauma victims and so on. But you know, anti-Semitism is rising, and we need to do everything we can to turn it around the other way. That means prayer as believers. That means standing up, challenging our MPs, standing up and challenging our United Nations representatives. Whatever it is, let us not allow denial of truth to be portrayed from the media and from any other source. We have to stand up and do what is right in God's eyes and pray. Have those, we talked about earlier, spiritual warfare. We need to do that in the right way at the right times.
Absolutely. We're down to the last 5 minutes left, and I kind of remember that kind of mid-90s time when I think it was after the signing of the Oslo Accords between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And once Israel gave more territory to Arafat, we started to see suicide bombings take place in Israel with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and it all looked like that Yasser Arafat gave a green light to these terror attacks. And one thing it did, and that was that Israel experienced the suicide bombings, they experienced the horrific terror attacks. And this is what Jew hatred does. Innocent blood was allowed to be shed in Israel, so that same fear and bloodshed and terrorism spread around the world. So what nation hasn't been affected by suicide bombings? We know that we faced quite a few in this country. France has faced a number of different terrorist attacks, the United States, Spain, Germany, many other nations around the world. Of course, we've seen them in Afghanistan and other places, Pakistan. It's been spread around the world because it comes to that blessing and cursing. And had the West and Britain defended Israel and say, look, you need to fight back and push back on these Islamic terrorist attacks, it would have spread around the world. But because we've do nothing when it comes to protecting Israel and the Jewish people, and we allow this Jew hatred to continue, it becomes a curse and actually ultimately threatens Western civilization because you're touching the apple of God's eye.
And the crazy thing about that whole part of history is that was, as you said, and I said, it was attacking innocent people and bombing innocent people, and yet it's from that time that the media has swayed towards looking at Israel as the aggressor rather than the one who's been aggressed against. So you realize it's a spiritual attack because logically you should be thinking, this is crazy. We should be standing, we should be doing everything we can to help Israel because they are not going around bombing Saudi Arabia or anywhere else. They're not going out and doing terrorist attacks anywhere else. But terrorist attacks are coming against them, like the recent Palestinian conflict with thousands of rockets being poured into the Israeli. It wasn't even against the army, it was against innocent villages and towns. And yet, you know, the media is still reporting it as if it's all Israel's fault. So we need to really fight this battle in the spirit and let truth be known. And praise God for Revelation TV, for its stand so regularly to do things like the Middle East Report, which actually confronts things that need to be confronted, where other people are thinking, let's keep off this subject. We are here to tell the truth and actually hopefully inspire more people to stand with Israel at this time, and nations too.
Alistair, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on the Middle East Report this week. Done a great job. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
And I just want to thank you for watching this program today. This is really a kind of warning call to our viewers to wake up to the dangers of Jew hatred that we are seeing not only in our country, but also throughout the world and the Western world. And we know that this is a disease that ultimately destroys our civilization, ultimately destroys our democracy, it ultimately destroys our freedoms, but but it's imperative from a biblical perspective and also from a compassionate perspective that we stand up to this rise of Jew hatred, that we stand in solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters and the nation of Israel, because we know that this is a demonic inspired disease that the Jewish people are facing, and we don't want to be that generation that failed in the 1930s and 40s to stand up to Nazism and fascism, and so we will stand up to the rise of Jew hatred we're seeing in the world today. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.